There is a man who fishes the same half-mile of river every Saturday morning. He has done it for 30 years. He can tell you which rock the big brown trout sits behind in July, which slow pool loads up with walleye after the first hard cold front of October, and which beautiful fishy-looking bend produces absolutely nothing, year after year, because the bottom is wrong for the insects that would make it worth a fish's time. He carries 3 rods. He never posts about any of it, and on a normal morning he will quietly outfish a season's worth of effort from the guy 2 bends downstream. Here is the part everyone gets wrong about him. They assume he is winning because he knows more spots, more patterns, more gear. And that is true, but it is not the cause. It is the symptom. What that man actually has, sitting behind his eyes, is a model of that river so accurate that he is almost never in the wrong place with the wrong presentation. And that is the real argument of this video. You are not slowly assembling a tackle collection or a bag of techniques. Whether you realize it or not, you are training a prediction engine. Every single cast you make is a data point you are feeding into it. And the only thing that separates a beginner, a 3-year angler, and a 30-year veteran is the resolution of that engine and how fast it learns. This is Fishing Lab Explained. Let's get into what that actually means. Start with the novice. And let's kill the most common assumption first. A beginner is not someone who has fished too few times. A beginner is someone whose model of the water was built almost entirely out of what other people told them. A YouTube video, a buddy, a forum post, and almost not at all out of what they personally watched happen. The model is borrowed. And a borrowed model is low resolution, because it was built for someone else's water, on someone else's day. That single fact explains every classic beginner behavior, and we actually have hard data on it. In early 2026, researchers from the Max Planck Institute for Human Development, TU Berlin, and the University of Eastern Finland published a study in the journal Science that is, quietly, one of the best things ever done on real fishing decisions. They put GPS watches and wearable cameras on 74 experienced ice fishers across 10 competitions on 10 lakes over 2 years, and logged more than 16,000 decisions about where to fish and when to leave. Here is the finding that matters. Even among people who all had experience, the ones who were catching fish leaned on their own read of the lake, their own model. The ones who were struggling did something else entirely. They oriented toward the crowd. They watched where other people clustered and treated that as the signal. The weaker someone's internal model was, the more they outsourced the decision to everybody around them. That is the novice in one sentence. When your own prediction engine is empty, you have no choice but to borrow someone else's eyes. It is why beginners fish the crowded bank, the nearest dock, the spot where they can see other rods bent. It feels like information. It is actually the absence of a model, dressed up as a shortcut, and the moment the crowd is wrong, the beginner is wrong with them. Now watch how the same empty model problem produces the famous gear mistakes. The classic beginner tackle box holds 30 lures in 20 colors, bought because they looked good in the store. That is not greed. It is a person searching for the answer outside of themselves, in the tackle aisle, because the answer is not yet inside them as a model. And the 2 most expensive specific mistakes follow directly. First, line. Beginners reach for line far too heavy, 15-pound mono in clear water, where a fish can practically read the label. The instinct is, heavier won't break, but heavy line is more visible, holds more memory, tangles more, and kills the natural drift of the bait. The beginner is optimizing for the 1 fish in 100 that might break them off, and quietly losing the 99 that won't even commit. They can't feel the trade-off yet, because they have no model that predicts it. Second, hooks, too big, and far too often too dull. A sharp hook needs only a light, deliberate set, and it buries itself. A dull one demands a violent yank that tears the bait loose as often as it connects. Sharpening a hook takes about 30 seconds and is one of the highest return habits in the entire sport, and almost no beginner does it, because it is invisible, and the beginner is still convinced that progress is something you buy, not something you sharpen. But here is the deepest problem, the one that actually traps people in the novice stage for years. It is not any single mistake. It is that the beginner cannot extract information from a cast. A blank trip to a novice means bad luck. A blank trip to a veteran means the fish weren't where I predicted. Why? The novice's model almost never updates because they keep crediting their results to luck instead of to causes. And a model that does not update does not improve, no matter how many hours you pour into it. This is also why beginners so reliably overestimate their own skill, a general human bias, but a brutal one on the water. If you think you already understand it, you stop interrogating your results, and the engine stops learning. So the fastest way out of the novice stage is not better gear. It is two things, and both are about feedback. First, get one day with a good local guide, not for the secret spot, but to download a working starter model of one specific water in a few hours, instead of a few years. Second, fish one body of water repeatedly, instead of 10 once each. Density of feedback beats variety of scenery every single time, because the engine learns from repetition on the same problem. So what changes between year 3 and year 10? The answer is not a milestone fish. It is the moment the angler starts deliberately training their model instead of passively hoping it grows. There is a real framework underneath this, and I want to give you the honest version, because the internet usually gives you the folklore version. You have heard of the 5 stages of fishing: catch a fish, catch a lot, catch a big one, catch a hard one, then just be happy out there. Fun campfire idea. Not science. The actual science is a 1977 concept from the sociologist Hobson Bryan called recreation specialization, the observation that people in any pursuit drift from generalists who'll do anything toward specialists who deliberately narrow their focus and refine their methods. And notice why narrowing works. Specialization is just concentrating your feedback. Fish one technique on one water across many conditions, and every trip teaches the engine something comparable to the last. Spread yourself across 20 waters and the data never stacks. The experienced angler narrows on purpose, so the lessons compound. And the single tool that defines this whole stage is almost insultingly simple: a logbook. This is the literal training loop. The experienced angler stops trusting memory, which is a liar, and starts recording water temperature, conditions, structure, what worked, what didn't. Over a season, patterns that were buried in noise rise to the surface, and here is the part most anglers never realize. This is the exact instrument professional fisheries biologists use. They call it catch per unit effort, CPUE. Total catch divided by total hours. Scientists track the health of entire fish populations with it. The experienced angler is running their own personal CPUE to do one ruthless thing: tell the difference between water that is genuinely dead and water they simply fished badly. That distinction is invisible without data, and it is the heart of a trained model. Now, the reason this is even possible is the most reassuring fact in all of fishing. The fish is predictable. A trout in a river is solving the same math problem every second of its life, and it cannot cheat. Holding in fast current burns calories it has to replace. Sitting in dead, foodless slack water saves energy, but starves it. So it hunts for one specific kind of real estate: soft water to rest in, right beside a faster lane that delivers food to its nose. Robert Bachman's landmark 1984 study of wild brown trout on Spruce Creek, Pennsylvania, documented this over thousands of hours. Individual fish choosing and defending precise feeding stations. Kurt Fausch put the equation under it that same year. Trout picked the position that maximizes net energy gain, calories in minus calories spent. The fish is a calorie accountant, which means its behavior is not random. It is a function you can learn. A perfect model of that river is, in principle, possible. The veteran is just closer to it than you are. So, reading water, the skill everyone treats as mystical, is really just running your model and watching it predict. The current seam, that visible line of bubbles where fast water meets slow, is prime because it is the fish's ideal compromise made visible to your eye. Foam is home is a cliché, but a sound one. Foam rides the slow edge of the seam, concentrates drifting insects into a tight ribbon, and shades the fish from birds overhead. Food, comfort, and cover in one line. The cushion of calm water on the upstream face of a boulder is prime for the same reason, and it is exactly where beginners never cast, because they are busy throwing at the dramatic whitewater behind the rock where almost nothing holds. The experienced angler reads structure as a map of where the fish was forced to be by its own energy budget. Even the architecture of the whole river sorts the fish for you, once the model can read the sequence. Riffles, shallow, broken, fast water, are the insect factory, the richest in oxygen and food, where trout slide up to feed in the cool of a summer morning. Runs, the deeper smooth water just below them, hold the bulk of the fish through the heat of the day. Pools are the deep, slow resting rooms. And here is a counterintuitive output the trained model eventually spits out. The tail of a pool, where the water smooths and speeds up before spilling into the next riffle, is one of the hardest places in the entire river to fool a fish. Not because fish avoid it, but because the physics fights you. The water at your feet is moving faster than the water where your fly lands, so it instantly drags your line and skates the bait unnaturally the second it touches down. And that glassy surface hands the fish a clean window to the world above, so it sees you long before you ever see it. A beginner reads a pool tail as easy water. A trained model reads it as a trap and approaches with the stealth it actually demands. The model also starts ingesting conditions as inputs. The experienced angler has personally fished enough cold fronts to expect a feeding shutdown in the day or two after one passes, and to value the falling barometer right before it. They know the 2 hours around dawn and dusk concentrate predator activity because the low light favors ambush. Now, a fair scientific caveat. Some of these condition rules are better supported than others, and the veteran treats them as probabilities, not laws. But that itself is the point. An experienced model deals in odds, where a novice deals in superstition. And then there is the execution, the skills that turn a good prediction into a fish in the net. Presentation control, the understanding that how the lure moves decides everything, and that the movement is controlled by rod tip, line tension, and pause. A drop shot fished dead stick catches far less than the same rig given subtle 2-inch twitches that make the plastic shiver like panicked prey. Hook set timing that adapts to the tool. A circle hook needs no set at all. You just reel until you feel weight and it finds the corner of the jaw, while a soft plastic base bite rewards a half-second pause before you drive it home. And the quiet one nobody films, landing percentage, not hookup rate, is what separates this angler from the beginner. Constant pressure, rod angle controlling the fish's direction, no slack, no panic at the net. The model didn't just find the fish, it closed. Now the veteran, 30, 40 years in, and here the engine does something that looks, from the outside, almost like doing less. The veteran moves less, carries less, casts less, commits to a spot with a patience that can look like laziness to a beginner. But that stillness is the most advanced thing on the water, because the experienced angler runs their model consciously, checking the logbook, weighing the variables, and the veteran has run it so many tens of thousands of times that it has dropped below conscious thought entirely. Psychologists call this tacit knowledge, understanding so automated you can no longer fully explain it, you just do it. Where the experienced angler knows fish hold behind structure, what the veteran knows that in water level, the fish sit 18 to 24 inches behind that particular boulder at the third bend, but only between 58 and 68 degrees, and below that, they drop to the deep pool 40 yards down. That resolution is not in any book. It was trained, cast by cast, over decades. And here is the reframe I promised you, the thing most anglers never see. The veteran does not pull ahead on the good days. They pull ahead on the bad ones. When a novice blanks, they learn nothing. It goes in the memory as slow day, bad luck. When a veteran blanks, the model updates. The fish weren't on the flat. The water came up 2 degrees overnight. So next time at this temperature, start deeper. The veteran extracts more information from a fishless morning than the beginner extracts from a banner one. That is the engine of 30 years, not the fish they caught, but the relentless updating from the fish they didn't. Skill compounds out of disappointment if you let it. This isn't romance, it's measurable. In a study released at the end of 2025, researchers worked with 30 veteran anglers on New Zealand's Rakaya River, fishers whose combined time on that one river system added up to 1,510 years. Using their oral histories and participatory mapping, the team reconstructed 7 decades of environmental change, vanished springs and pools, a shrinking river-mouth lagoon, declining native fish, changes that formal scientific sampling, limited by budget and a few years of funding, had simply missed. The veterans' trained models held data the instruments never captured. The engine had become an instrument in its own right. The veteran also knows the one variable a beginner never accounts for: themselves. They know which conditions they personally fish badly: high wind, low light, a technique they never fully built, and they either drill it deliberately or steer around it. They fish the conditions in front of them, not the conditions they wish were there, not their favorite method out of habit. The model includes a model of its own blind spots. It even shows in how they move, where a beginner moves out of boredom or frustration, and an experienced angler moves on a hunch. A veteran moves only once the current spot has produced an actual conclusion. The evidence says the fish are not here, so the next stop is a specific place, chosen for a specific reason, with a prediction attached to it. Same number of steps across the bank as the beginner. Completely different information driving every one of them. It even includes the fish's biology. And here the real science corrects a popular myth. Veterans are careful with catch and release, and you'll often hear that any air exposure does lasting harm. The data is more precise than that. A 2025 study in Biology Letters ran 238 rainbow trout through simulated catch and release and tested their memory afterward. Air exposure did cause a real impairment in the fish's working memory, but it was transient, gone in 3 to 4 hours, with no trace at 1 week. The study's own conclusion was that fish are remarkably resilient and that catch and release remains sustainable. So the veteran keeps the fish wet not out of panic, but out of precision. They know the actual temporary cost and choose to spare the animal even that. Superstition out, respect in. And the final move, the one that truly separates a veteran from everyone below, because catching no longer challenges them, the joy migrates to teaching, and teaching forces something remarkable. To explain the seam, the boulder cushion, the temperature break to a beginner, the veteran has to drag all that automatic, invisible knowledge back up into words. That act of articulation is exactly where the best veterans find the last holes in their own model. The best teachers turn out to be the best learners, because to explain your model, you have to inspect it. So what actually separates the 3 anglers? It was never talent, it was never luck, and it was never the size of the tackle box. It is one thing, expressed at 3 resolutions: the quality of the model behind the eyes, and how relentlessly it learns. The novice borrows a coarse one from the crowd. The experienced angler trains a sharper one on purpose, with data. The veteran has run theirs so long it became instinct, and it sharpens fastest on the days it gets things wrong, which hands you something you can use on your very next trip, with no new gear and no new spot. Stop measuring your day by how many fish you caught. Start measuring it by how many times your model updated. After every cast, and especially after every blank, ask the one question a veteran never stops asking: what did that just teach me about where the fish actually are? Because the man on that same half-mile of river every Saturday morning did not start out knowing where the brown trout lived. He found out the way the engine always learns, by predicting, being wrong, and going back the next Saturday to feed it one more data point. There is no shortcut to that. But there is, very clearly, a direction. This is Fishing Lab Explained. If this changed how you see your own water, subscribe and tell me down in the comments. Which stage is your model fishing in right now? We'll see you on the water.